It was 6:30 a.m. The city was just waking up. The sky over downtown glowed pale orange, and the glass walls of Brighton financial towers shimmered with the first touch of sunlight. Inside, the lobby was quiet, except for the soft squeak of a mop sliding across the marble floor. The man holding it was Calvin Brooks, the building's janitor. He moved with calm rhythm, almost like he'd turned cleaning into an art form. His hands were steady, his shoulders slightly hunched from years of work, and his old sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished tiles. A faded photo of a young girl peeked from the corner of his wallet whenever he bent down. His daughter, Lena. Calvin hummed a slow jazz tune as he worked, the kind of melody you'd hear in an old record shop, gentle, soulful, full of quiet pride. He didn't need anyone to tell him he was doing a good job. He just knew. Most people who passed through the lobby barely noticed him. The suits, the executives, the interns, they all walked past, glued to their phones, clutching their lattes, talking about meetings and mergers. To them, Calvin was part of the background, like the walls, the lights, or the floor itself. But Calvin didn't mind. He'd been invisible for a long time, and he had learned something most people never do, that dignity isn't about who sees you. It's about what you do when no one's watching. Still, there were mornings that hit him harder than others. Mornings when he'd watch young men in $1,000 suits walk in, men half his age, barking orders into Bluetooth earpieces, acting like the world revolved around them. He wondered sometimes what it would have been like to be in their shoes, but he never let that thought stay long. He had bills to pay, a daughter in college, a promise to keep to his late wife that their girl would never have to struggle the way they did. So he kept wiping, kept mopping, kept humming. That was his rhythm, his peace. But that day was different. As he wrung out the mop and looked toward the front entrance, he saw something unusual, a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulling up to the curb, the kind of car that made everyone else's head turn. The chauffeur jumped out first, dressed in all black, opening the rear door with crisp precision. Then out stepped Ethan Wallace, tall, confident, and impossibly well-dressed. He was the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke. Ethan Wallace wasn't just any businessman. He was the name in the finance world. The youngest self-made billionaire on the East Coast, founder of Wallace Capital, and a man famous for two things: turning struggling companies into gold and crushing anyone who wasted his time. He was there to deliver a talk titled Success and Strategy, The Billionaire Mindset. But before heading upstairs, Ethan stopped. His sharp eyes had landed on Calvin. The janitor, still working quietly, was down on one knee, scrubbing a scuff mark off the marble near the elevator. Sweat trickled down his forehead, but he didn't complain. Ethan tilted his head. There was something about that scene. This older man cleaning floors while he, a man half his age, owned buildings like this one, that stirred his ego. He smirked and walked over, his leather shoes echoing across the lobby. "You've been working here long?" Ethan asked, his tone casual but condescending, the kind of voice that expected to be answered. Calvin looked up, surprised that someone in a designer suit was even talking to him. 8 years, sir," he said politely, "since the place opened." Ethan raised an eyebrow. 8 years? As a janitor? "Yes, sir." Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. 8 years as a janitor. Must not be very ambitious." The words hung in the air like a slap. Calvin paused mid-motion, his hand still gripping the mop handle. For a second, his calm eyes flickered, not with anger, but with something deeper. Pain. But then, he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from knowing who you are. "I do what I can with what I have, sir." That simple sentence hit harder than Ethan expected. He was used to people defending themselves, or groveling, but this man didn't do either. He spoke with quiet confidence, no bitterness, no shame. Ethan folded his arms. "And what do you have exactly?" he asked, clearly fishing for something to mock. Calvin wrung out the mop, straightened up, and looked him right in the eye. "I've got 2 hands that work, a roof over my head, and a daughter who's going to graduate next year. That's enough for me." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, at least for Ethan. He forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "That's good for you," he muttered, glancing at his watch. "Keep up the good work." Calvin nodded and went back to mopping, as if the exchange meant nothing. But it meant everything. Because in that small moment, that humble answer, something inside Ethan shifted. For the first time in years, he felt challenged. Not by a rival investor or a business problem, but by a janitor who seemed richer in spirit than he'd ever been in money. Ethan walked toward the elevators, but his mind stayed behind in the lobby. The sound of the mop against the floor echoed in his head like a drumbeat. He didn't know it yet, but that one conversation, that one quiet man, was about to teach him more about success, respect, and real intelligence than all his expensive books and boardrooms ever had. That one humble line would change everything. The elevator doors closed behind Ethan Wallace, but his mind wasn't on his presentation anymore. All he could think about was that janitor, Calvin Brooks. Something about the man's calm tone had thrown him off balance. Ethan had spent years surrounded by people who chased his approval, who nodded at everything he said, who called him a genius to stay in his good books. But that janitor hadn't cared who he was. He'd just told the truth. By the time Ethan reached the 45th floor, the event space for his morning conference, the irritation was starting to itch. "Who does that man think he is?" he thought, "talking to me like an equal?" As the day's event began, Ethan stood before a crowd of young entrepreneurs, investors, and executives. Cameras flashed. His company logo glowed on a massive LED screen behind him. Wallace Capital, building tomorrow. "Success," he began, "is about hunger. It's about doing whatever it takes to rise. Winners create their chances. Losers wait for them." The crowd nodded, hanging on every word. But mid-speech, Ethan's gaze drifted to the back of the room, to the glass walls overlooking the lobby far below. From that height, he could see a small figure pushing a mop across the marble floor. Calvin Brooks. And just like that, Ethan's speech didn't feel as powerful anymore. His words about hunger and success suddenly sounded hollow. Because what did hunger really mean? The man downstairs probably knew more about survival than any millionaire in this room. When the talk ended, applause filled the hall. People rushed to shake Ethan's hand, to take selfies, to flatter him. But while everyone else headed for coffee and small talk, Ethan walked straight to the elevator, back down to the lobby. Calvin was still there, polishing the brass trim near the revolving doors. His back was slightly bent, but his movements were deliberate, graceful. Ethan approached, hands in his pockets. "You're still at it, huh?" Calvin looked up and smiled politely. "Work doesn't finish itself, sir." Ethan smirked. "You've got quite an attitude for someone cleaning floors." Calvin shrugged. "Attitude's free, sir." "Might as well have a good one." Ethan chuckled, but his pride flared. "You really think a good attitude gets you far?" "It gets you somewhere," Calvin said, gently wringing out the mop. "And somewhere is better than nowhere." The answer made a few nearby employees look up from their desks. Ethan felt a small sting, not from disrespect, but from truth. He was being outclassed in humility, and he didn't like it. "All right, Mr. Brooks," Ethan said finally, leaning against a column. "Let's see if you're as smart as you're humble." Calvin looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Ethan's grin widened. "I'm holding a private business session upstairs this afternoon. The best financial minds in my company will be there. Analysts, strategists, traders. We'll be reviewing a real investment problem. If you're as wise as you sound, how about you join us?" A few people nearby stopped working. You could feel the room tighten. Calvin blinked, surprised. "Me?" In your meeting? Yes, Ethan said. Here's the deal. I'll give you one of the same problems my team's been stuck on for a week. If you solve it, I'll give you... He paused, looking him up and down. $1 million, gasps. Heads turned. Even the security guard near the desk froze mid-step. Calvin laughed softly. Sir, that's a lot of money to bet on a janitor. Exactly, Ethan said smugly. So, what do you say? You win, you walk out a millionaire. You lose, you polish every shoe in that conference room before the day ends. The crowd around them murmured, half shocked, half entertained. But Calvin didn't back down. He looked Ethan straight in the eye and said, All right then. Deal. The words hit like a spark in dry grass. Ethan's smile faltered for just a second. He hadn't expected the janitor to agree. He'd expected hesitation, maybe fear, not quiet confidence. He cleared his throat. Good. Be upstairs by 10. Don't be late. Calvin nodded, picked up his bucket, and said calmly, Wouldn't dream of it, sir. As Ethan walked away, a few onlookers whispered among themselves. Is he serious? He's gonna embarrass himself. Man's about to lose his job over pride. But one woman, a young receptionist named Lydia, whispered to a coworker, Something tells me he's gonna surprise that man. Calvin finished his shift quietly, moving through the lobby with his usual care. But every now and then he'd pause, glance at the clock, and take a deep breath. At 9:55 a.m., he stood before the elevator dressed exactly the same as before, work uniform, name tag, and a small notepad he kept in his pocket. As the elevator doors slid open, a few employees stared, some amused, some worried. Good luck, Mr. Brooks, Lydia said softly. Calvin smiled. Luck's just preparation waiting for a moment. And with that, he stepped inside. The elevator rose, 10th floor, 20th, 30th, 40th. His reflection in the mirrored walls looked calm, but his heart was steady with purpose. He wasn't going up there to prove anything to anyone. He just wanted to show that worth doesn't wear a suit. At 10 a.m. sharp, the doors opened to a boardroom filled with laughter, luxury, and disbelief. Ethan stood at the front of the room, flanked by men in tailored suits and women with laptops open. He gestured toward Calvin. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice dripping with arrogance, meet Calvin Brooks, our janitor who thinks he can solve what my team of analysts couldn't. The room erupted in polite laughter. Someone even clapped mockingly. But Calvin didn't react. He just looked at the whiteboard full of numbers, charts, and graphs, like he'd been invited to clean the truth out of the mess they'd made. He took a step closer, studying it carefully. Then he said in his calm, low voice, All right, sir. Let's see what you got for me. And just like that, the janitor everyone ignored was about to shock an entire room of millionaires. The elevator doors slid open on the 45th floor with a soft ding. The sound barely drew attention at first. The room was already alive with chatter, polished shoes clicking on marble, expensive perfume in the air, the soft buzz of phones and laptops. Every seat was taken around the long glass table. Executives in tailored suits filled the room, sipping coffee from porcelain cups that probably cost more than Calvin's weekly groceries. Then they noticed him. The man in the gray janitor's uniform. Name tag slightly faded, shoes clean but old, holding a notepad instead of a briefcase. The laughter started small, a whisper here, a smirk there. Is this a joke? Someone murmured. Maybe he's here to clean up before the meeting. Another chuckled. He brought his mop. Ethan Wallace, standing at the head of the table, smiled like a man setting a trap. Gentlemen, ladies, he said, raising a hand to quiet them. This is Mr. Calvin Brooks, our janitor. I've invited him today for a little experiment. More chuckles. Someone even clapped sarcastically. But Calvin didn't flinch. He walked toward the whiteboard at the front of the room, his posture straight, his face calm. Ethan leaned against the table, smirking. "You remember the deal, right, Mr. Brooks?" "Yes, sir," Calvin replied. "If I solve your problem, I get $1 million. If I fail, I shine everyone's shoes." A burst of laughter filled the room. Even Ethan grinned. "That's right. So let's begin." He turned to the board, where a maze of graphs and numbers filled the space. "This," Ethan said, "is the performance chart for one of our investment projects. The market's rising, yet we're losing money. 10 analysts, 2 weeks, no answers. Think you can do better, Mr. Brooks?" Calvin stepped closer, studying the board. The room went quiet, except for the ticking of the clock. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. Just looked, his eyes tracing the curves and lines, the columns of data, the small handwritten notes in the margins. Someone whispered, "He doesn't even know what he's looking at." Another voice snickered, "He's stalling." But Calvin ignored them. He pulled the marker from its holder, erased a tiny number near the top, and circled a section of the chart. "This right here," he said finally, his voice steady, "is your mistake." The laughter stopped. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, do tell. You're comparing projected growth against quarterly performance," Calvin said, underlining the numbers as he spoke. "You should be measuring net gains against market movement, not your internal shift in assets. It looks like growth, but it's just reallocation. You're counting your own money twice." Silence. Every head in the room turned toward the screen. Analysts scrambled for their laptops, rechecking formulas, typing furiously. Ethan frowned. "That's impossible." But one of his senior data specialists interrupted, eyes wide. "Sir, he's right. The baseline's off by exactly that ratio." Another analyst confirmed. "He found the error." "That's the leak we've been chasing." For a moment, no one spoke. Ethan stood frozen, staring at Calvin like he was seeing him for the first time. Calvin handed him the marker. "You weren't losing money, sir. You were just counting it wrong." A few people exchanged stunned looks. The same people who had laughed minutes ago now sat speechless. Then Ethan broke the silence. How did you see that?" Calvin smiled faintly. "Numbers are like people, sir. They tell stories. If you listen close enough," Ethan blinked. "You're telling me you can read financial data like that?" "You're a janitor." "I used to be an accountant," Calvin said quietly. "For 15 years, until my wife got sick. I quit my job to take care of her. After she passed, I needed work close to home, something stable. The janitor position opened up here, so I took it. Been here ever since. No one moved, no one laughed." Ethan felt something twist inside him, guilt maybe, or shame. He'd tried to humiliate this man for entertainment, only to be humbled himself. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. The room watched in disbelief as he wrote down a number, 1 million. When he tore the check from the pad, the sound was louder than it should have been. Ethan walked around the table and handed it to Calvin. "A deal's a deal," he said, his voice lower now. "You earned it." Calvin looked at the check but didn't take it right away. "Sir, I didn't do this for the money." "I know," Ethan replied, pushing it gently toward him. "That's why you deserve it." The room was still silent. A few people even stood, clapping quietly at first, then louder, until the entire boardroom was applauding the janitor who had just outsmarted them all. Calvin finally took the check, folded it neatly, and said with that same quiet dignity, "Thank you, sir. But if you don't mind, I should get back downstairs. The floors won't clean themselves." Ethan laughed, not mockingly this time, but with genuine respect. "You're something else, Mr. Brooks." As Calvin walked toward the elevator, a few executives stepped aside to make room for him. One of them whispered, "That man just changed everything." And he had. Because that morning, in a room full of people chasing wealth, a janitor had reminded them what real value looked like: wisdom, humility, and pride in honest work. When the elevator doors closed, Ethan looked down at the floor, still hearing Calvin's calm words in his head. I do what I can with what I have. It hit different now. He turned to his stunned team and said, Cancel the rest of my meetings. I've got something to think about. The applause still echoed in Ethan's ears long after Calvin stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and for the first time that morning, Ethan Wallace, the man known for his sharpness and pride, stood completely still. He looked down at the whiteboard. The same messy data that had frustrated his best analysts was now perfectly explained by a man who cleaned floors for a living. The irony stung. All his life, Ethan believed success was about being the smartest person in every room, about winning. But that janitor had walked in quietly, said almost nothing, and dismantled the arrogance he'd built his empire on. He turned to his staff, who still sat frozen in disbelief. You all saw what just happened, he said slowly. A man with no title, no team, and no fancy degree found what you all missed. Think about that. No one dared reply. Ethan loosened his tie, sighed, and muttered, Meeting dismissed. Down in the lobby, Calvin was back at work, just like he said he would be. The mop glided smoothly across the floor, catching the light that streamed in through the tall glass windows. He looked at the folded check in his pocket, but didn't even glance at the number. To him, it wasn't about money. It was about respect and the satisfaction of proving that what's inside a man can't be judged by his uniform. That's when the sound of footsteps approached. He turned, and there was Ethan Wallace. No entourage, no assistant, just the billionaire himself standing quietly in front of him. Calvin straightened. You're back already, sir? Ethan smiled faintly. Seems like I still have a few lessons to learn. Calvin wiped his hands on a towel, waiting for him to continue. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Why'd you stay here all these years? With your mind, you could have worked anywhere. Calvin paused. He looked down at the floor for a moment before answering. After my wife passed away, I had to raise my daughter alone. I needed a job that wouldn't pull me away. Something steady, simple, something that gave me time to be a father first, and everything else second. Ethan's confident posture softened. That's admirable. Calvin smiled gently. It's life, sir. Sometimes you don't choose the path, you just walk the one that's left and make the best of it. Ethan nodded slowly. And your daughter? You mentioned she's graduating soon? Yes, Calvin said proudly. Lena. Smartest girl I know, got into college on scholarship, studying business too. She'll do great things, God willing. Ethan chuckled. So she got that sharp brain from you. Calvin grinned. Maybe a little. But mostly from her mother. For the first time in years, Ethan Wallace, the ruthless businessman who once thought emotion was weakness, felt humbled. Standing before him was a man who had lost everything that mattered and still managed to stay grounded, kind, and wise. Calvin, Ethan said after a pause, what you did upstairs, that wasn't luck. That was brilliance. I don't want to just hand you a check and walk away. I want to offer you something better. Calvin frowned slightly. What's that? I want you to work for me, Ethan said. Not as a janitor, as a consultant. You clearly see things others miss. I could use someone with your kind of mind. Calvin shook his head gently. Sir, I appreciate that, but I'm not sure that world's for me anymore. I'm happy where I am. Ethan smiled. That's exactly why I want you. Because you're the only one who doesn't chase the money. Calvin chuckled quietly. You really think your team would take advice from a janitor? Ethan's voice turned firm. After today, I think they'll listen. For a moment, both men stood silently. The lobby was bright now, the morning sun gleaming through the glass like a spotlight on two completely different kinds of success. Finally, Calvin spoke. If I do this, I want to do it my way. No title, no fancy introductions. I don't want people treating me like a symbol. I just want to help where I can. Ethan extended his hand. Deal. Calvin looked at it for a second, then shook it, a handshake between equals. That afternoon, Ethan called an all-company meeting. His employees gathered in the same conference hall that had hosted the humiliation earlier that day. When everyone had settled, Ethan took the stage. But this time, his tone was different. No arrogance, no performance. Just sincerity. Earlier today, he began, I made a mistake. I tried to test a man's worth based on his job title. I wanted to prove I was smarter, but instead, I proved how ignorant I can be. The crowd stirred. Ethan gestured to the side of the room, and Calvin stepped in quietly. This is Calvin Brooks, Ethan continued. He's worked here 8 years, not as an executive, not as an analyst, but as our janitor. And today he solved a problem that none of us could. But more importantly, he reminded me, and I hope all of you, that wisdom doesn't need a corner office. The room erupted in applause. Not the polite kind this time, genuine, respectful applause that lasted longer than Ethan's entire speech that morning. Calvin looked a little embarrassed by the attention, but he smiled warmly. He didn't say much, just nodded and whispered a simple thank you. After the meeting, Ethan approached him. You changed the way I see success, he said. Calvin shook his head. I didn't change it, sir. You just looked at it from a different angle. Ethan smiled. You know, I think that's what you've been doing all along, showing people angles they never noticed. Calvin chuckled softly. Guess you could say that's part of the job, too. And for the first time in a long, long while, both men laughed together, not as billionaire and janitor, but as two men who finally understood what worth really meant. Weeks passed. The story of the janitor who outsmarted the investor spread through the company like wildfire. People whispered it in hallways, mentioned it over lunch, and shared it in group chats. But for Calvin, life didn't really change much. He still showed up early, still greeted everyone with that same calm smile, and still took pride in keeping the building spotless. The only difference? Now, people saw him. Employees who once walked past without a glance now stopped to say good morning. Some asked for advice, not about cleaning, but about life. And Calvin, humble as ever, just laughed and said, Start by cleaning your own mess first. The rest gets easier after that. One afternoon, Ethan found him again, this time on the rooftop garden where Calvin liked to eat his lunch in peace. You're hard to find these days, Ethan said, smiling. Calvin looked up from his sandwich. I thought billionaires were good at finding things. Ethan chuckled. Touché. Listen, I wanted to tell you something. He paused, choosing his words carefully. That day, the day I challenged you, it changed me. I've been doing this for 20 years, chasing numbers, deals, and power. But you reminded me what business, what life, is really about. Calvin smiled quietly. Respect goes both ways, sir. You gave me mine back that day, too. Ethan nodded. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't taken that challenge? Calvin leaned back, thinking. Honestly, I probably wouldn't have cared. I didn't do it for the money. I did it because I don't like seeing people look down on others. My mother used to say, the moment you think you're better than someone, you start losing the parts of yourself that matter most. Ethan was silent for a moment, letting that sink in. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a document. I know you didn't care about the money, he said, but I still wanted to do something meaningful. I set up a scholarship in your wife's name for single parents who want to go back to school. It's called the Grace Brooks Foundation. Calvin froze, his hands trembling slightly. You didn't have to. I did, Ethan said firmly. You reminded me what purpose looks like. It's time I built something that matters more than profit. For the first time, Calvin was speechless. His eyes glistened as he whispered, "Thank you." That night, when Calvin returned home, his daughter Lena ran to the door holding an envelope. "Dad, look, it's from the company." He opened it. Inside was a letter personally signed by Ethan Wallace. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for showing us that greatness has no dress code. You reminded an entire company that true intelligence isn't about where you work. It's about how you see the world. E.W." Lena smiled proudly. "You're famous now, Dad." Calvin laughed softly. "No, baby. I'm just the janitor who taught a rich man how to listen." The next morning, back at work, Calvin passed a group of young interns near the elevator. One of them nervously stopped him. "Mr. Brooks, sir, how did you stay calm that day when everyone was laughing?" Calvin smiled. "Because I knew something they didn't." "What's that?" the intern asked. "That respect isn't given," Calvin said. "It's earned, quietly, through what you do when no one's watching." The elevator dinged open, and as Calvin stepped inside, the sunlight reflected on the mop bucket nearby, shining almost like a trophy. He turned slightly and added, "And sometimes, son, the smallest job can carry the biggest lesson." Moral of the story: never underestimate anyone based on what they do or how they look. Intelligence, dignity, and greatness often wear the simplest uniforms. And as for Ethan Wallace, he never hosted another humiliation challenge again. Instead, he started a new tradition. Every year on that same date, he personally cleaned the company lobby alongside the janitorial team, a reminder that real success starts with humility. Because in the end, the janitor didn't just win $1 million deal. He helped a millionaire find something far more valuable: his humanity.